mother answered the door, and her mother said, wow, to deal with all this and still be all right, you're so strong. And I remember saying, wow, it's so hard it's so exhausting being so strong all the time. And that was the moment that I kind of like opened up and started bawling my eyes out and stuff. It's funny how someone can say something to you that just strikes you to your core and just unlocks all this within you, or gives you permission to open up completely. My name is Teddy Rycroft, and in this video I'd like to discuss my experiences with death and how embracing and understanding death has given me a better appreciation for life and gratitude just in general. I'll share a few stories and then a few reflections as well. One of my first experiences with death was in a place called Sertar in Sichuan province near Tibet in China. I lived in China for a year after high school when I was 19, and during the latter part of my trip, I took a trip up to Chengdu in Sichuan. Actually, I was part of a rugby team, and we had this big tournament in Chengdu. After the tournament, a friend of mine invited me to this place called Sertar, which is the biggest Buddhist monastery in the world. I had never heard of it, but it sounded like a cool adventure, so I agreed to go along. We took this bus, I think it was like 18 hours. This bus ride wove us through the mountains around Sichuan province. And at checkpoints, because I was a foreigner, I had to hide under a blanket because foreigners weren't allowed. It was really kind of sus. I don't know if I'd do it today at 29, but at the time I was all for it. I remember getting ready to put my head under a blanket and thinking this is so ridiculous, and looking back and seeing this mother in her 40s who was obviously from the States or something with her like 7-year-old son, and she was like, all right, here we go, whoop. So I thought, all right, we in here. We arrived in Sertar in the evening, and I remember we stayed in this small little B&B thing. I went outside to use the bathroom, and the stars were so vibrant and so bright. It was something so immaculate that I didn't really get to experience much growing up in a big city. In the morning, my friend's friend, who was a monk at Sertar, led us into the area and showed us around. It's really an extraordinary place because it's nestled in one of these valleys in the steppes of Central Asia. So as far as you can see, it's all these green rolling hills and blue sky. And then nestled in this valley is this huge monastery, and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes and abodes and little shacks, and they're all painted red. It's this brilliant red area in this sea of green and rolling hills. It's something truly spectacular. We spent the day visiting a few of the temples, and his friend was showing us around. And later in the day, he took us to what was called a sky burial. Again, I wasn't too sure what it was. I was just rolling with it and going along with it all. Very happy to be there. My friend's friend, the monk, brought us to this hillside where a few other people had gathered, maybe 15 or so people. We sat on the hillside and looked down to the bottom of the hill, where momentarily a monk would come with a wheelbarrow filled with big burlap sacks. He reached the bottom of the hill and he dumped these sacks onto the ground and then went back to fetch some more. These sacks were filled with dead bodies and people that had died, either monks or people in the nearby villages. Another monk came out with an axe and started kind of chopping them up through the burlap sacks. I couldn't see much really because they were still in their sacks, but he started hacking away and cutting them up into pieces. At the same time, these large vultures had started to land on the hill behind me and my friends and other people that had gathered. There were a few at first, but they slowly grew in number until there were about 30 or 40 vultures behind us. I've never seen vultures in real life before. I'm not sure if you have, but they're quite large and they're somewhat imposing. And as the monks continued to dump more bodies into this area, the vultures started to kind of trot down the hill. And there were so many you could start to feel the hill shake with their feet, and they were trotting, and then they kind of got to a gallop. And by this point, they're coming down the hill whether we're there or not. So I got the hell out of the way, and everyone else got out of the way too. And these vultures bolted down the hill and just descended upon this mass of burlap sacks and bodies. The idea is that the remains of these people, of these souls that have left us, are being returned to the earth, feeding the animals that are part of this grand ecosystem called life. I recall very distinctly the pungent aroma in the air. It was something that's striking and hard to forget. I remember sitting there in silence and in contemplation with a deep sense of respect for what I was seeing and a sort of humility, the humility you have when you recognize you were just a guest somewhere. I recall turning to my right and seeing these other tourists who had come from Beijing. I could tell because of the accent. They were dressed pretty well, and you could tell that they were of a certain level of wealth. And I remember this one woman holding a parasol so she wouldn't get a sunburn, and this other woman laughing and giggling and pointing at the vultures and the dead bodies, and that same woman taking pictures on her phone. Something about that really rubbed me the wrong way. There was a stillness in the air, despite the fact that the vultures were going crazy, and a calmness to it all, and a sense of peace. I can't quite explain it, and I can't quite articulate what it was about that was significant, but it just left a really big impression on me as one of my first experiences with death. My second significant experience with death would occur in 2016 on Thanksgiving Day, when my father suddenly passed away. He died of a heart attack or some heart-related failure. His health had been declining steadily in the past few years leading up to that day, but it was still very sudden, and none of us really expected it to happen. I had come home for the holiday from school, and I was 22 at the time. The past few years leading up to that point had featured me gaining a better relationship with my father, becoming more of an adult to adult relationship where I didn't loathe his counsel or see him as some annoying authority figure, but recognized he had a lot of love for me and a lot of value to offer me through his counsel and through his advice and through his perspective. I was sleeping in the top bunk bed of my sister's bunk bed, and my mother woke us up to celebrate Thanksgiving Day. She went to the neighboring room where my father was sleeping and opened the door a bit and then emitted this sound that I cannot ever forget. It was a very strange sort of cry, sort of exhale of surprise and fear and dread. And part of me already knew what had transpired. Part of me remembered a time when I was 16 or 17 looking at my father and realizing I'm only growing stronger and moving more towards life, and he's only growing weaker and away from life. I could sense on a spiritual level the decline of his health. So I went into his room where his clothing rack had fallen over and he was lying on his bed curled up in a fetal position, and I walked over and I laid my hand upon his shoulder. It's strange to touch a body that's no longer living. It's cold to the touch. It's like an inanimate object, like a bench or like a bag. There's something that you never realized was always there that's suddenly not there, and it becomes so clear to you that you had this expectation that there would be warmth there that was no longer there. I don't know what it was that allowed me to enter into this highly focused state, but throughout the day I was able to compartmentalize my feelings and execute the tasks necessary to ensure everyone was taken care of. I called the ambulance, I called my older sister, I called my friends, I informed the rest of the family, and throughout the day I was just somewhat stoic and composed. I'm grateful that a buddy of mine whose mother passed when we were even younger came by and he took us out to get some food, and the rest of the day was spent in a sort of haze while I heard back from relatives that I had reached out to and whatnot. It wasn't until the evening, I recall so clearly, I was walking over to another friend of mine's home, and her mother answered the door, and her mother said, wow, you're to deal with all this and still be all right, you're so strong. And I remember saying, wow, it's so hard it's so exhausting being so strong all the time. And that was the moment that I kind of like opened up and started bawling my eyes out and stuff. It's funny how someone can say something to you that just strikes you to your core and just unlocks all this within you, or gives you permission to open up completely. Me and my friend Merritt would walk to the park and just talk for, the next few hours. And we went to this bar and got stupid drunk. Some sleazy bar with vinyl seats. The months and years following that were filled with a lot of sadness, of course. There was a lot of regret about what I wish I had done and said, and how I wish our relationship had been and whatnot. I remember using songwriting and my music as a way to process all the grief I was feeling. I talk about it in a video I'll put right here. I left school, I took a semester off, and I lived with a buddy of mine down in North Carolina. The relationship I was in at the time became long distant, and we started to slowly peter out, I believe as a consequence of my depression. I relied on tobacco and drinking throughout those years as a way to cope with and hide and mask those feelings I was feeling. One thing about it was that it was so sudden. Someone was there in my life, and then the next day they weren't. There's nothing special or profound about that. Life is very fragile and impermanent. To go throughout your life as if that weren't the case is understandable, because the alternative, understanding that at any moment life can be snuffed away from you, it's a pretty sad and depressing outlook to take. And yet at that time it was so forced upon me by the suddenness of his death. It would take years for me to get to a point where I had processed all that and returned to something that you could call stability. But from that point on, I always had this understanding of how temporary things were and how someone you loved could be gone the next day. And I think that slowly started to contribute towards the gratitude I have towards life. About 5 years after that, when I was living in Los Angeles, I reconnected with a buddy that had ironically been the guy that drove me from college to DC when my father died. And we connected in LA. He was doing pretty well, and he was working on directing a short film and wanted me to star in it because I had acted in college, and he was very impressed. He was very, very friendly with me and very intimate and very kind, so much so that because of my experience in LA, I almost was taken aback a bit and feared that maybe he was being disingenuous or inauthentic. But I continued to hang with him, and we started to work more together, and I was cast in this short film that he had called Redline as a meth smoking addict on the subway train. I remember I had helped him with logistical things leading up to the shoot, which was somewhere over in North Hollywood, and it was all very interesting and new and kind of exciting for me and for him. This was his first time directing, and he was really getting a lot of stuff together. It was quite interesting and impressive to see. After the shooting, we would hang out on occasion. I actually helped him move at one point, and I remember loading the stuff onto this U-Haul and sitting outside his old apartment, and we shared these Cuban cigars, and I watched these trees with their berries slowly swaying in the Los Angeles heat in the summertime. He was about my age, 28, and he had all this stuff going for him, and he was so excited. And I got the call maybe a few weeks after that from another friend of mine who had been his previous partner and was still his friend, informing me that he had suddenly died as well. I don't really know the details, but suffice it to say, he had just gone to bed and didn't wake up. This experience with death was maybe my most strange. The biggest feeling I had was guilt. I didn't know how to mourn his death appropriately. I felt that he had been so kind and open and warm towards me, and I was still kind of just warming up to him a bit. So when he passed, I had this sadness, but I was also, I guess, a bit distant, to be honest, and I felt like I had been wrong to have kept him at such an arm's length and to be cautious towards letting someone close to me. I saw his friends and family posting online, and I really just kind of stood by the sidelines and didn't say much. I remember after my father died, counseling other people when their kin or friends died and telling them there's no right or wrong way to mourn. It's just this roller coaster that you're gonna be on. You can't control it. You can only sit back and try to enjoy the ride as much as you can. It was difficult to take that advice when Jake died. A close friend of mine had, like I said, dated him for a while, and she was quite torn up about it. And I just felt alien and strange and unsure how I should mourn, if anything, and feeling guilt that I didn't feel sad enough. It was something I would try to wrap my head around, and I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. The stories I've just told you have this theme of being sudden and unexpected, and I'm grateful for that. As I mentioned earlier, the idea that your life could be over in any minute is incredibly scary to think about. And yet, on the flip side, when you recognize this is the case, you grow profoundly grateful for life and every single moment of it. When I recognize that so little is known about the future, and it could change at the drop of a hat, my connection to right now grows deep and strong and profound. I listen to the birds, and I look out at the grass swaying in the breeze, and I watch the children playing on the playground. So every action, every movement, every second of sensory experience becomes a profound expression of joy for me. So right now on my journey, I'd say I've reached a point of stillness and peace. And by embracing death and understanding death as just a part of life, not an interruption of it, not an enemy of it, not the antithesis of it, but the other side of the same coin, I live more freely. I sit in stillness and I'm filled with gratitude. These have just been some of my reflections about death and about life. I hope that they're of service to you. I hope they give you a perspective that inspires you or encourages you or fills you with peace. Once again, I'm Teddy Rycroft. I'll see you later.
跟叔叔讲这是什么？nice day 什么意思？嗯，不会讲了。问我。啊？什么？问我。问你哦。You are YouTube。
对对对。
对啊。来，
我要跟你一起照相。
你还要跟你照相？叔叔在拍片，我们走，不要。
可以啊。
你不要这样，这叔叔的，拿黄给叔叔。
不是我的。
我要跟你照相。
不行。
可以啊。
好 ，OK， 好，照到，耶！好，那给叔叔拜拜，好，
拜拜。
好，拜拜，小朋友。
好，拜拜。
拜拜。